3 years after the University of Idaho murders left 4 college students dead.
So police have gotten 600 tips. They've conducted 90 interviews, but still no suspect or motive.
Ryan Koberger appears to have struck a plea deal with prosecutors in the case of the Idaho college murders.
November 13th, 2022, Moscow, Idaho. A quiet college town in the United States, 4 University of Idaho students were killed inside a rented off-campus house on King Road. The location was a 3-story residence commonly shared by students, situated in a residential neighborhood near the university campus. The victims were Madison Majin, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Madison Majin and Kaylee Goncalves had spent the evening together before returning home during the early hours of the morning. Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, who were in a relationship, had attended a fraternity event earlier that night and later returned to the same residence. At approximately 1:45 a.m., Madison and Kaylee were seen at a local food establishment in downtown Moscow. They were later dropped off at their residence shortly after 2:00 a.m. Xana and Ethan returned to the home around the same general time frame after their own social activities. Inside the house, multiple roommates were present. Some were asleep in their rooms. Others were awake intermittently during the night. Between approximately 4:00 a.m. and 4:25 a.m., investigators later determined that an intruder entered the residence. The entry point was believed to be a sliding door on the second floor. The suspect moved through the structure, bypassing certain areas and going directly towards specific rooms. Madison and Kaylee were attacked in a shared bedroom on the 3rd floor. Xana Kernodle was attacked on the 2nd floor in her bedroom area. Ethan Chapin was also present in the same 2nd floor area and was killed during the same sequence of events. The attack occurred quickly, and the suspect exited the residence shortly afterward. One roommate, who lived on the 1st floor, reported hearing unusual noises during the early morning hours. Another surviving roommate later stated she saw a masked individual inside the home moving toward an exit. The individual was described as wearing dark clothing and leaving through the same general direction of entry. After the intruder left, there was no immediate report of emergency services being contacted. The surviving roommates initially believed the noises might have been related to normal activity within the house. Several hours passed before the situation escalated into an emergency response. At around noon, one of the surviving roommates contacted friends who then attempted to check on the occupants of the house. Upon entering the residence, they discovered the victims unresponsive and immediately called emergency services. Police were dispatched to the King Road residence shortly after the 911 call was placed. When officers arrived, they secured the scene and began an initial assessment of the interior. The victims were confirmed deceased at the scene. Law enforcement immediately treated the residence as a homicide scene and restricted access to the property. The surrounding area was secured to preserve potential evidence. Investigators observed multiple victims across different floors of the house. The layout suggested that the incident had occurred while most occupants were asleep or otherwise unaware of the intrusion. There were no signs of forced entry visible at the main access points, although investigators later focused on alternative entry routes. The crime scene indicated that the attacker had moved through the house in a deliberate path rather than random movement. This pattern became an early focus of the investigation. Forensic teams began collecting physical evidence, documenting room conditions, and identifying possible trace materials. Investigators also began interviewing surviving roommates and anyone who had contact with the victims in the hours leading up to the incident. Nearby security cameras, including residential systems and commercial properties in Moscow, were reviewed for any unusual activity during the early morning hours. Investigators also began analyzing cell phone data from the area to identify unusual movement patterns. One key early observation involved vehicle activity. Surveillance footage from the area showed a white sedan repeatedly passing near the King Road residence during the early morning window. This vehicle became a central point of interest as investigators attempted to identify its owner and track its movements. At this stage, law enforcement maintained that there was no immediate threat to the broader public, although they continued treating the case as highly active and urgent. As the investigation expanded, authorities began focusing on potential suspect profiles, including individuals familiar with the area and individuals who may have had prior knowledge of the residents or occupants. Cell phone tower data was analyzed to determine which devices were present in the area during the relevant timeframe. This data helped narrow down movement patterns consistent with the suspected vehicle's route. Investigators also examined online purchases and records related to potential weapons consistent with the injuries observed during autopsies, although specific details were initially withheld from the public to preserve the integrity of the investigation. As forensic analysis progressed, a critical piece of evidence emerged from the crime scene: a knife sheath recovered near one of the victims. This sheath contained DNA evidence that did not match any of the victims or known individuals connected to the house. This DNA profile became one of the most important leads in the case. Investigators entered the DNA profile into national databases, attempting to find a match. At the same time, they continued tracking the white sedan observed near the residence and cross-referencing vehicle registrations across multiple states. The combination of vehicle identification efforts, digital tracking, and DNA analysis began to narrow the focus of the investigation toward a single individual who had no known connection to the victims but matched certain behavioral and geographic indicators being studied by law enforcement. As these investigative threads converged, authorities prepared for an arrest operation. This process narrowed attention to Brian Kohberger, a criminology PhD student at Washington State University. Further investigation into Kohberger's movements showed that his phone had been detected near the Moscow area multiple times prior to November 13, 2022. On the night of the incident, however, his phone records indicated that it was either turned off or not actively connected to the network during the critical time window when the killings occurred. Investigators also examined purchasing records and online activity. One key finding involved an Amazon purchase of a Cobb bar-style knife and sheath months before the incident. The sheath found at the crime scene later became the primary DNA linkage point in the case. DNA recovered from the sheath was processed through genetic genealogy techniques and ultimately led investigators toward Kohberger as a likely contributor. Once a familial match pathway was established, surveillance and corroborating evidence were used to strengthen the identification. Law enforcement conducted extensive physical surveillance of Kohberger's residence and vehicle. His driving patterns were monitored, and his movements were tracked using license plate readers and traffic cameras. In late December 2022, authorities organized a coordinated arrest operation. Kohberger was traveling cross-country with his father at the time. On December 30th, 2022, he was arrested in Pennsylvania at his family home. At the time of arrest, investigators collected his vehicle, electronic devices, and personal items for further forensic analysis. He was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. Following the arrest, Kohberger was extradited to Idaho to face prosecution. Prosecutors began building their case using multiple categories of evidence: DNA from the knife sheath, cell phone records showing gaps in activity during the critical time frame, surveillance of a white sedan matching his vehicle near the scene, and digital data mapping movement before and after the incident. The defense challenged the DNA interpretation, the reliability of cell tower data, and the lack of direct eyewitness evidence placing Kohberger inside the residence. Court proceedings moved through pre-trial motions, with both sides disputing the admissibility of certain evidence and the scope of expert testimony. The case was set for trial, with extensive evidentiary hearings scheduled to determine what would be presented before a jury. As the legal process continued, The case drew significant public attention due to its scale, the academic background of the accused, and the nature of the forensic investigation that led to his identification. For the victims' families, the legal process concluded without a full trial. Brian Koberger pleaded guilty in July 2025, ending proceedings before the evidence could be fully examined in court. The final sentence for life terms without parole closed the case legally. However, with no trial, key aspects such as motive and potential challenges to evidence were never tested before a jury. What remains clear is how the case was built. Investigators combined digital tracking, genetic genealogy, and surveillance data to identify a suspect with no confirmed connection to the victims, resulting in a case that was resolved, but not fully examined in court.
I hereby sentence Mr. Koberger as follows. On count 1, burglary, 10 years fixed, 0 years indeterminate. I also impose a fine of $50,000. Count 2, first-degree murder of Madison Mogan. I sentence the defendant to a fixed term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a fine of $50,000, and a civil penalty of $5,000 payable to the family of the victim. On count 3, for first-degree murder of Kaylee Gonsalves, I sentence the defendant to a fixed term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a fine of $50,000, and a civil penalty of $5,000 payable to the victim of the family. On count 4, for the first-degree murder of Xana Kernodle, I sentence the defendant to a fixed term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a fine of $50,000, and a civil penalty of $5,000 payable to the family of the victim. On count 5, for the first-degree murder of Ethan Chapin, I sentence the defendant to a fixed term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a fine of $50,000, and a civil penalty of $5,000 payable to the family of the victim. The sentences on counts 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 shall run consecutively to one another.